All right, so welcome back. So now we want to talk more about the crew themselves, your people as resources. There are really three kinds of people that are involved on your burn crew. There's the burn boss. You can call him a fire boss or an incident commander, but they're the person who is ultimately responsible for the fire. A squad leader, often called the line boss, but it's not quite true just to call them a line boss because they could supervise other types of squads, such as internal ignition. But basically, a squad leader is taking a group that's under the authority of the burn boss or under the leadership of a burn boss, and a leader is going to guide a crew of usually 2 to 5 people to accomplish a task, and that task might be operating ignition and holding on a particular line. They could be lighting internally. They could be just looking for spot fires that are occurring outside of the line. Those are the typical squads that you might have on any particular crew. So each of them have a leader, and each of those leaders report to the burn boss. On each crew, you might have, especially if you have two line crews, you would have somebody who's lighting the fire, somebody who's using water immediately, somebody who's using a flapper, somebody who might be watching, and you might have an additional person who might be lighting strip fires under the guidance of the squad leader and or the burn boss. So those are all different roles that crew members on one line can perform. Now, if you're not a line crew, but you are a squad or an ignition squad, especially an ignition squad that's doing internal ignition, then you might be working with your squad boss to light around a no-burn refugia or to light those strip fires or other means that are necessary, lighting around internal structures that are inside the unit but cannot burn. So those are different squads that can be used. Some squads just will be on a large burn, say a 500-acre burn. You might have people who are on UTVs and they are driving around back and forth along the outer edges of your unit. So they are looking for spot fires that might be occurring well after the crew has moved beyond those points. And so those would be a spotting squad that's out there just looking for spot fires to occur. That would be an example. You might have a crew that's moving resources around. So they're refilling water, bringing new water up to refill pump cans, or bringing up drip torch fuel to refill torches. That would be another squad that you might have. So they're doing resources. But each of those squads has a leader. Each of those leaders of a squad report to the burn boss. Each of the crew members within a squad report to that squad leader. They do not generally report to the burn boss as a whole, so that the span of control is the burn boss is responsible for the whole fire, everything on the fire, and they are directly communicating with the squad leaders. Each squad leader is responsible for their crew members that are direct reports to them, and they are interacting with those crew members. Um, and but they are trying not to interact with other squads that are working on the same fire. So that's the that's the hierarchy that's in control. It's important to maintain that hierarchy, even if you're a bunch of neighbors helping each other out. That hierarchy can still be important, especially if something goes wrong, and to maintain safety. Miscommunication is probably the biggest reason why errors get made on a prescribed burn and injuries happen or fires escape is probably often due to improper communication. And so maintaining that hierarchy so people know who they're supposed to communicate with is as important as knowing what they're supposed to communicate. So the burn boss is responsible for the burn plan preparation, or at least implementing a prepared burn plan. They're responsible for getting the proper permits and making sure that the proper notifications are done. They don't necessarily need to do the notifications. That might be done by the landowner, for example, but they are responsible that those notifications are in the burn plan and that they are done before the burn is done. They're responsible that a proper equipment is on site and ready for the burn, and that the proper training for a crew is there. If they're working with volunteers, that's perfectly fine, in my opinion. But those volunteers, then they need to know what the experience is of those volunteers, even if it's none. I think it's fine to have crews on the line who don't have any experience, but then you need to make sure that there are people who can be mentors for those inexperienced crew members, and that you have a unit that is constructed in such a way that you can safely deploy inexperienced people on. So when I'm working with volunteers, I tend not to have grass breaks, or if I have grass breaks, I don't have inexperienced people on those grass breaks because they take more experience, where I make sure that there's plenty of mentors to work with those inexperienced crew members so that they can learn how to manage fire on a grassy break, as just one example. So it's not necessary to have um, rigid certifications for crew members, but you do have to make sure that the kinds of experience you're expecting with your crew members is integrated with the kind of burn that you expect to do. And generally, when you're working with inexperienced people, it takes longer to do a burn. You have to spend more time in briefing. You have to go slower when you're actually lighting fire. So you can't get as much done as quickly as, say, a well-trained crew has been burning together all spring long, and they can show up and they can probably do the burn in a third the time that it would take you to do the burn if you're working with inexperienced people. So, in my opinion, it's not good or bad if you have experience versus no experience, but it is important to make sure that you're integrating how much experience you have in your crew with how you actually implement that burn. The burn boss needs to inform the crew of the plans and of the hazards that exist for that particular day on that particular unit. They need to go through a checklist to assure themselves that everything is in place for that burn to be conducted safely. They have the ultimate responsibility and the authority for controlling that burn and the safety of the crew. And so their final decision is final. So you can disagree with a burn boss and you can ask questions or state that you disagree. But once they say, I hear that, but this is what we're going to do, then it's time to be quiet. And you just have to kind of do what you think is possible, or say, I don't think this is safe, and excuse yourself from the burn. That is certainly something that you can do. The burn boss, as I had mentioned before, is to communicate with squad leaders. Um, Generally, not directly with crew members as necessary, but one example would be a burn boss might be watching a crew member as they do a strip fire across a unit. So they're coordinating that person moving from one line squad to a second line squad and making sure that they get out of the unit safely, or that the whole time that they're in the unit, which is a watch out situation, that they have somebody watching them and are safe. The burn boss is controlling the pace of the burn and the sequence of the burn, and in particular, controlling where the two lines are relative to each other to make sure that all the fire that's being lit is being lit in a safe manner. And then finally, they are responsible for securing the burn after it has been completed. So they're making sure that the mop up is done appropriately, and that the follow-up situations, if there's a need for it, are maintained. That people are know what to do for babysitting. That the reporting in is clear, and that the authority of who's responsible for the burn after the crew leaves is clear. The squad leader does pretty similar things, but they are responsible for the crew members on their squad only. So they're coordinating the safety and the implementation of the prescribed fire of their crew members. They're responsible for communicating with the burn boss as well as their crew members. They are controlling the pace and the timing of a fire ignition for their line if they are on a line crew. They are responsible for rotating crew members in tasks so that they don't get too hot or too smoked out or too tired or too whatever. Um, as they are working on that line so that you are managing resources effectively and efficiently. So you don't want to use too much water. You want to know where your next water is. You want to know where your next drip torch fuel is. You're monitoring how much of those resources that you've used. But as far as crew members are concerned, you're also measuring the important resource of their stamina. And so you want to make sure that your crew members are comfortable as well as knowledgeable in terms of what they're supposed to do. You also want to confirm the readiness of when you're ready to move to tie. You want to be thinking forward in terms of as you're approaching your point of commitment. You want to be thinking about what you need to have in place once you're at that point of commitment so that you don't have to spend 15 minutes at the point of commitment before you're ready to move to tie. Um, and so thinking forward is an important part. And if you're on a if you're on a line or spotting crew, you need to know what to do and to communicate with the burn boss. If a spot fire occurs, you need to know what to do in the case of spot fires and act accordingly in terms of communication as well as responding appropriately to a spot fire. For a crew member, you're communicating with your squad leader, you're following the direction of the squad leader, you're conserving and monitoring the use of the resources that you have available to you, you are staying safe and comfortable, and you're being aware of any watch out situation, and in particular, spot fires and escapes. This would be true for if you're carrying the torch and using the torch, if you're using the water in your pump can, using a flapper, being a spotter, doing strip fires, all those roles have these same sorts of responsibilities. Generally, no member is lighting more fire than what their crews can handle. And so it's all crew members' responsibility of maintaining a state of awareness. So if you've got a line, you can have the person at the head of the line is using the torch. That is not necessarily the squad boss, but they are responsible. They got to make sure that they're not lighting more fire than what their crew can deal with. So in this case, there's 5 people on this crew. The first person might be using their water because this is where the fire break is at its narrowest point, and you've got fires that is occurring. You might have a second water, another person using a flapper, and a person using the flapper, but also maybe walking behind them and making sure that nothing creeps around them or no spot fires occur. The person who's lighting, they want to be lighting right on the edge of the break so that, this fire is essentially a strip fire. And so if they're lighting in from the break, it's going to be hot getting towards the actual fire break. They want to conserve their use of fuel, and they don't want to light any more fire than what their crew can handle. Notice in both of these cases, these people are using their equipment well. Their backs are straight. They're holding the handle of the drip torch down low. This person doesn't have gloves on. They should have gloves on. And so that's a problem there. But basically, they're lighting fire right on the edge of the break, which is what they should do. And in this case, they have extra water that they're carrying with them. The first water is responsible for cooling down the water. If you see here, this person is using a mist um, on their pump. I tend to not like, that's basically where there are 2 holes in the nozzle. I prefer that people use the nozzle that has just a single hole, because if you have very hot fire, you can all of a sudden stand back 15 feet away from the fire and still operate your pump can efficiently. Whereas you can see here, this is about the maximum distance you can use the mist from a fire. So it works in this sort of case, but it doesn't work if all of a sudden you have a spot fire. Now, a way to get a mist with that single nozzle is you use your finger to make a mist out of the out of the wand that you're using. Now, most people, like this person, is using their finger to really occlude the opening. And so you see the mist is very small and there's not much force to it. And they've actually had to take their glove off, which again is not a desirable thing to do in order to use it. Using a pump can correctly is a real challenge. And just as much as I might hand you a guitar, and you could, as soon as I hand you a guitar, even if you've never touched a guitar before, you could make sound come from the guitar. That's not a problem. But making music come from the guitar is a problem. And the difference between making sound and making music are basic nuances that require muscle memory, require knowledge, require practice, 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 and practice. A pump can is really no different. So the ability to use your finger to make a mist that breaks up the water and spreads it out, but still has force in that water, takes a lot of practice before you can use it well. But the person is holding the base of the wand in the palm of their hand close to their body, so they're pushing against their body rather than pushing just against their arm. So this part is really good in the way that they're using the pump can, but you should have gloves on and the finger should be kept straight and just deflecting that water just a little bit. The flapper is a great tool to use because it can save gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of water. So a flapper used well can really help your resources that you have. And so this flapper is a very useful tool to use. It's a misnomer in that you generally are never flapping it, but you're using to smothering it, or you can sweep it. And in general, you're always sweeping things into the black. So you're putting your flapper on a fire like this and you're moving it into the black, putting it on more fire like this and moving it into the black. And notice that they're letting this fire burn. And so this has a long handle and you can do that. If the rubber, it will melt, it will even catch fire if it gets really hot, and you can cool this down with a flapper. When you're on a burn, the squad boss and the burn boss should be monitoring how much resource they have remaining on their line, because in theory, you should be able to put out your fire anytime from when you light at the point of origin until you are ready to move beyond the point of commitment. So the only time you will not have enough resources to put out the fire is when you're moving the tie. And that fire that you're lighting is so big, you're not going to be able to put it out with the resources that you have. But anytime before that, so anytime before you move out from your points of commitment to the tie point, you should be able to put out the fire if things are not going in a way that you feel comfortable. And this is what this crew is doing at the International Crane Foundation, is we chose to put out the fire because we were having too many spot fires occurring. And so the overall humidity was lower than what we thought appropriate. And so we put our fire out. So one of the things that if a squad boss asks you, how much water do you have? The only answer that can be problematic is enough, because that tells a person nothing. What you want to do is, if they say, how much water you got, you can say, I'm half full, I'm full, I'm 3/4 full, I'm a quarter full, I'm an eighth full, whatever you choose. And you can figure that out usually by shaking your back and getting an idea as to how much water is in your can. It's a 5-gallon can. So if you're half full, you got about 2.5 gallons. So this isn't a precise measurement, but it's a good measure of how much water that you have currently on your backs, basically. Now, you can also either pre-position water, so you can take 5-gallon containers of water and position them out on your line so that you can refill water as you move along. You can do the same with drip torch fuel. Or if you have pickup trucks with 100 gallons of water on them, or UTVs with 30 or 40 or 50 gallons of water on them, you can move them around on the line and say you might have a squad that's carrying resources around, and they can fill your crew back up. So it's a squad boss's responsibility to know how much water is available if they're leading a line. And it's a fire boss's responsibility to know how much resources that they have remaining for the whole burn, and addressing the question, if I need to, can I put this fire out? So there's two levels of precision basically for resource management. One is to complete the burn, and the other is to complete the activities for a particular line. And those can be made more easy by having pre-positioned extra resources or mobile extra resources that can be brought to people. Some of the things that are important to keep in mind is you want to keep your crew comfortable. So if they spend a lot of time in the smoke, you need to switch them out to, say, being the igniter, so that they are usually the igniter gets the least amount of smoke. Occasionally, you can have them be on the other side of the fire. So you see the smoke here, and this person is not in the smoke. But if there any time that you are in a position where you are between, where you're standing in unburned fuel and there's fire between you and your safety zone, that is a watch out situation. So you can see that this is a backing fire. So the fire is not going to come towards me very quickly. But if suddenly the wind has an eddy or changes direction, and I'll show you an example of this. In a bit, you can be in a watch out situation. And so anytime you're in that watch out situation, you should be thinking about, where's my escape? Where can I go out of, where can I get out of this in case all of a sudden the fire behavior changes? Other issues to think about are obstructions that are within the burn unit. I worked at the International Crane Foundation for almost 30 years. We had lots of education displays and infrastructure that we had to burn around. You can use your water to create a immediate break around things like trail signs and things like that, or you can pre-make a break around this where we've removed a lot of the vegetation, and then we can go in and use water when we light along this to keep the heat down on this. If we don't remove the vegetation from here, there's a lot of heat that goes towards this, and that can be too much heat that gets transmitted to the wiring that are on the inside. So here, the purpose of the grass break is to decrease the amount of fire that's occurring in the short vegetation. We can use water to put it out, and then the intense heat is farther away from the metal container. And the rule of thumb is, if you can stand at the base of the structure and with the fire in front of you, and not have to move because it's so hot, then this is probably going to be fine. So fire breaks around some of these things before the burning can be quite useful. But for things as simple as a sign like this, where heat radiating onto this isn't so important, you can wait until the time of the burn. You do, however, have to have in your burn plan and make sure that your crew understands what areas and what you need to do in order to keep these from burning. So when we walk the break for this particular unit, we pointed out these structures and said these need to have water put around them. So you do need to communicate about it, but it's perfectly fine to use water at the time of the burn in order to keep the structures from burning. And you can see that this person here is using their finger to create a mist and doing it properly. Fuel load and obstructions are very important to keep in mind when you're doing a prescribed burn, and this is just a great example. This is a fairly heavy fuel load, so you have big blue stem and Indian grass located right next to a fence. Now, we mowed around the fence, but it takes an awful lot of water. If you're lighting right here, it takes an awful lot of water to keep this fence from catching fire, because remember, our fire break should be 2 to 3 times the height of the vegetation, and this vegetation is 8 feet high, so it should be 16 to 24 feet width. And if we would have done that, we would have been way up here and had half of our unit mode, and that would defeat our purpose. But having a small break like this creates other hazards. So you have to use a lot of water to keep this fence from burning. In addition to a lot of water, you have to use a lot of energy, because there's a human being, in our case, who's pumping that from their pump cans to keep this out. But there's a third issue that's really important. If we are doing a ring fire, for example, and we have one crew coming in here and one crew coming in here, they meet here, they have no place to exit. They're pinned from backing away from the fire because they have a fence here. They have radiant heat from the fire that they have here, and they can't exit in either direction because this is all radiant heat. So a fence can be an additional hazard for your crew, because they prevent you from free movement and being able to back away from intense heat from the fire. So taking one line and bringing it all the way through here so that they exit where they have an exit point. Say there's a gate in this fence so that they can exit where there's a gate. And you need, if you have them, two people coming together, you need to make sure that they come together at exactly the same time and they can exit that gate, um, or things like that. And you can see that it is possible. The fence still stands and the area is burned. So this is a photo point. And so it is possible, but it is always a hazard with fences to make sure your crew doesn't get pinned between the edge of the fire break, where the heat is going to be most intense, and being able to move away. Safety and communication is always critical. So talking about a briefing before you do the burn and then a briefing after you do the burn, called an after action report, are both important things to do. Having walkie-talkies, even if it's only an acre in size, can be very, very useful, because yelling across fire, yelling across a slope or in the woods is always very difficult. And so having radios and using them appropriately can be quite important. So briefing before and after and use of radios are very important. All crew members are responsible for the acronym LACES, which stands for Lookout, Anchor, Communication, Escape Zones, and Safety. Now, from a suppression perspective and a prescription perspective, LACES are important for both philosophies, but they differ between the two different philosophies. So, for example, a lookout from a suppression perspective tends to be one person whose sole job it is to be away from where the crew is working with fire, looking for what fire is doing around that crew. And if the fire begins to threaten where the crew is, they need to communicate with the crew what is happening, and they need to do that early enough so that the crew can use their escape routes and depart from the area to be safe. On a prescribed burn, everybody has a lookout circumstance, because everyone could be in a position where they are at risk, a watch out situation. And so everyone is responsible for their lookout capabilities. You don't generally have somebody who's outside of the unit acting as a lookout, because everybody is trying to be aware of where the fire is, what the fire is doing, and how does that relate to their plan. And so everybody might be at one time or another in a watch out situation and need to be on the alert. And so prescription, everybody's a lookout. Suppression, usually one or several designated people out of an entire crew are the lookout. Anchor points are sort of the same. Anchor points need to exist for a whole unit when you're talking about a prescribed burn, so that if you have fire in a ditch, you want to make sure it's anchored all the way to a road so that fire can't possibly go around you in that ditch, even if it's slow. Or at your points of commitment, you need to make sure that you're anchored into that fire break very securely, so fire is not able to go around you. Anchor points for a fire suppression is you need to be in a black area. You need to make sure that anchor points, that you've got solid black areas where you're working out from so that you can be safe. And that would be true on a prescribed fire. If you're putting out a spot fire, for example, the first thing you do is establish your anchor point by putting out the backing fire and then working on your flanks. But you're anchoring yourself by having a black area that you can always be working from within, because the fire is out in those black areas. Communication, is the chain of command clear, and has the plan of action been explained properly with hazards identified? If chain of command is not clear, or if hazards have not been identified, those are watch out circumstances, and people should be asking questions. Escape routes for a fire suppression are very different from escape routes for fire prescription. And what I mean by that is, from a lookout circumstance, if a fire behavior is changing and going to threaten where your crew is, you need to know what your escape route is to move out of that area. In a prescribed fire, your escape route is the black that you're already creating. So generally, you're never going to be looking for an escape route per se. You're always going to be looking for a safety zone. And more often than not, that safety zone is at your feet, where that black area is. So being cognizant of the fact that the safety zone is always going to be a black area, and it's usually going to be close to you, is important. For people who are doing, say, internal ignition in that fire, everyone on your crew should have a lighter so that if there is a need to create a safety zone, you can light an escape fire, which is you light fire right at your feet, let that burn out, and then you go into that black and lay down. So generally, you're never going to be creating an escape route when you're doing a prescribed fire, but you are always going to be knowing where your safety zones are, which generally are going to be black areas, but they could be inert soil breaks or things like that. And they're going to be places where you can immediately go to be safe from a fire that's escaping. And for safety, an important part of safety, in addition to communication, is have contingencies been discussed? Is there, has it been clearly identified what to do in the case of an emergency? Who do you dial? What is the emergency number? Where are you located so that you can tell emergency where you are located? Um, where keys are to a vehicle, is that vehicle a standard or an automatic? Those sorts of contingencies should be gone over so that everybody on the crew is aware, because you never know where what might happen when emergencies occur. The other thing that's always useful is when you're doing a prescribed burn, oftentimes you need to make arrangements of where somebody is going to meet the emergency crew, and then how are you going to get that emergency crew to the actual place of the emergency. And of course, the place of the emergency could be fire, but it also could be a medical emergency. And so where do you go to find a person who is injured, and how do you get them out, from there, for example, would be part of that safety discussion. So all of that is denoted by the acronym LACES. These day and age, the term anchor has been dropped, and so LACES is LCES for National Wildfire Coordinating Group. We prefer to keep the A in the LACES because anchors are very important in prescribed fire. So some of the other hazards that you want to be talking about is smoke management. If you're burning in areas that are green, you can have an intense amount of smoke that is very accurate. And you need to be quite careful with what that smoke does, where it blows after it leaves your unit, and what is going to happen to it. Is there good dispersion of that smoke or poor dispersion? So all of those can affect how you do your burn, whether you burn or not, and how you manage your crew. What's downwind is important. So at the International Crane Foundation, if I'm burning this area and I'm burning with a southwest wind, I've got a third of the world's captive population of whooping cranes and a fourth of the world's population of Siberian cranes downwind of me. I need to know what I'm going to do if I have a spot fire that occurs outside of this unit, in terms of safety protocols. So I can have a spot fire will be directly attacked. We have a secondary line, which is a gravel road, so that we would go back to that secondary line and backfire from that line. And we have a safety zone where we can backfire from here so that we could contain a spot fire that's occurring in this area by backfiring from those areas. That would be an example of what to do in case we had a spot fire, but it also means that we want to avoid, say, a southwest wind and not even burn with a southwest wind, because we have a lot of birds that are downwind of that, and we don't want to move a lot of smoke through their cage, so that we generally can only have a west wind for this unit or a north wind for this unit, so that smoke is blowing away from our captive population. Watch out situations can also occur when winds change speed or direction suddenly. Increasing temperatures, which decrease the RH, especially if they're beyond what was forecasted. Frequent spot fires is a watch out situation, and you might well decide to put the fire out. A lack of communication about safety and contingency plans. If you don't hear that discussed, that is a watch out situation in and of itself. And anytime you are in unburned fuel that exists between you and the fire. So if you're standing in the unit like here, you're in unburned fuel and it's between you and the fire. And so if the wind changes direction, you're at risk. If for some reason you're incapacitated, you're in this fuel, you're at risk. So you need to be very careful in those circumstances. Some hazards that you can look for relative to this green fuel, when you approach this fuel, you've got a much heavier fuel load. So your fire behavior will change from barely being perceptible in this green vegetation to burning up high here. So that fire behavior changes with your fuel load, and that in and of itself is a watch out situation. Always recognizing what fuel loading are you approaching at your feet that you're going to be lighting, and what is the fire going to do in response. A hazard here would be the steep hill. So fire goes up a hill more quickly than it goes down a hill. So if you're lighting with your crew downhill of this slope, you're going to want to stop with that crew and have one stop with your fire, say down at this tree, and you're going to want to have 3 people walk up the hill without lighting fire, stop at the top of the hill, light their fire up here again, leave one person there, and then with the torch and one person with water, light going down the hill. If you're lighting going down the hill, you can control the fire. If you're lighting going up the hill, the fire controls you, and you always want to be in control of the fire. So the hazard here is the slope or the change in slope in this particular unit. Another hazard that's of similar nature is any time that your fire break changes direction, it will change fire behavior, and you need to think about how is that fire behavior going to change. Is it going to become more intense? Is it going to go from a flanking fire to a head fire, or is it going to go from a flanking fire to a backing fire? If it's going to go to a head fire, you might need to think about doing something that would be similar to posting, so that you don't light a head fire if you're not able to contain it. Another hazard here is bulges in your line. So we have been burning this out, and we had to stop for a point, and then they just started lighting this. And so we might want to burn this off so that if the wind changes direction, it moves along this line. Whereas here, this is a backing fire here. If the wind shifts direction, this fire will burn very hot going in this direction. Or if the fire goes and if the wind comes and goes in this direction, the fire is going to go at a very unprotected line. So you tend not to want to have bulges in your line. You want to have straight lines along your line, because that way if wind changes direction, it always is going to be flanking on you rather than sending a head fire at a line that's relatively unprotected. So in this case, I'm lighting a strip head fire. You can see that this is very hot as I'm lighting. I'm in a watch out situation because I'm in fuel, and there's unburned fuel between me and the fire. And so I'm in a watch out situation. I'm looking that I'm going to exit right here. I'm already looking for where my exit is. And if this fire changes direction on me, might need to move towards that exit very quickly. In retrospect, and the way I tend to do things now, perhaps because I'm older, generally, if a person is in a watch out situation, you don't want them to be carrying a can, because that just amplifies the watch out situation. If you don't wear a can, it makes the watch out situation a bit more manageable because you're a little bit more nimble than you can. So in this watch out situation, it's always useful, for example, for the line boss over here, to be watching me and reporting to the fire boss when I'm actually out in the black so that I'm safe. So there should be, anytime somebody's in the unit, there should be eyes on that person to make sure that they are safe. So in summary for this second part of the how in doing a prescribed burn, there are 3 types of crew: the burn boss, the squad boss, and the crew member. Each have different responsibilities, and it's important that those responsibilities are well coordinated. Remember LACEs: lookout, anchor, communication, escape routes, and safety. Those are a mantra that all crew members on a prescribed burn crew should know and understand. And remember again that there is a difference in philosophy, not better or worse. There's a difference in philosophy between prescription and suppression, and especially as it relates to how do you interpret what LACEs really means for you. So how a prescribed burner implements LACEs is different from how a person working on a suppression crew implements that same acronym. So with that, I'll talk to you again when we look at a video talking about a ring fire technique so that you can see it in living reality. Thanks much for your time and your patience.